Poisoned ground. Part 1. Any port in a storm.
The worn wipers thrashed across the windshield, each sweep throwing a spray of water to one side or the other of the old green Land Rover, while barely making any difference to the torrent of rain that cascaded down the flat glass. The 6 young occupants were silent and moody. Listening to the radio, crackling with static, didn't improve that mood. Category 5. Hurricane Yasi is expected to cross onto coastal areas within the next few hours. Are advised to take cover and make final preparations. We will bring you the next hurricane advise immediately it is issued. The announcer's voice died away as Kathy turned the volume down. I told you we should have left as soon as the warning started, she said angrily. Don't blame me if we get caught out in the open when it comes. Paul gripped the steering wheel tightly. He refused to even look at her as she continued with her briefly interrupted criticism. It's not his fault, Max interrupted, leaning forward, defending his friend from the rear bench seat. We couldn't have left any sooner, not without abandoning all the gear. And what would happen next semester if we turned up at uni without their equipment? I don't give a damn about their equipment. Kathy snapped back, now honing her attention to him. Diane sat quietly listening to them, and to the others. They had all become more hostile as the rain had become heavier. She was as worried as anybody, but fighting between themselves wouldn't help. Maybe we should stop somewhere and ask if we can take shelter, she said nervously. Don't talk stupid, snapped Jason cruelly from the front. He waved the folded map in his right hand. Like where? We're kilometers from anywhere. You mean you actually know where we are? Interjected Kathy. I hope one of you does, because I can't see a damn thing, muttered Paul, craning his head forward, squinting out to where the dim headlights clawed between the arched trunks, crowding the track from either side. Diane spoke again, her voice excited. There it is again. What? Said Paul. I saw a light again. For a moment they were all quiet as their eyes strained to see. Up ahead, over there, she pointed off to their left. What did you see? Said Max belatedly. The bespectacled youth trying to look in the direction she indicated. Rubbish, you can't have. We're at least 10 kilometers from the nearest road, grumbled Jason as if he actually knew. I tell you I saw one, flickering through the trees over there. She pointed into the bush. Closer now. There must be a house. Even Paul glanced quickly, taking his tired eyes momentarily from the rutted mud, straining his vision into the almost impenetrable darkness. There's nothing there, said Max in disappointment. It's just your imagination, added Kathy. I'm sure But they had already returned to their mickery. Are you sure we're on the right track, Jason? I don't remember coming this way before, started Max. Jason's angry face was highlighted from the faint glow of the instrument panel. We came out in daylight, with no rain, he replied, drawling the words out in a sarcastic tone. Everything looks different in the rain, and it looks different at night. Is that too hard to understand? I saw it again, cried Diane, interrupting him. There, through the trees. Oh, for God's sake, where? Grumbled Joanne from beside her. I can't see anything. Is it a house? Said Max. It can't be a house. This is National Park. Nobody lives in a national park. Maybe it's the ranger, said Kathy hopefully. For once and for all, started Jason. There's no... He stopped in disbelief as the headlights picked up a break in the trees. There's a driveway. Paul was already slowing. They were almost up to it when he accelerated and drove past. Where are you going? Aren't you going to stop? Shouted Kathy, looking back out of the rear window as the track disappeared into the darkness behind them. If there are houses around here, we must be closer to the road that director we thought, Paul said as he drove on, ignoring her. Nice map reading, Jason, Joanne muttered. Barely a kilometer further along, they came to the creek. They pulled up at the top of a low bank. Nobody needed telling it was in flood, carrying trees and branches on a one-way trip to the Mulgrave River and on to the Coral Sea. They watched in silence until Max spoke. "It looks deep." Paul pushed the metal handle down and forward. "I'd better check before we try to cross." His voice sounded as if he wanted someone else to say they would do it, but no one did. "Give me a hand, Max." "You're joking. Go out there." "What are you going to do?" said Joanne nervously. "Find out how deep it is." Paul's voice was nearly drowned by the noise of rain that was now spraying through the top of his part-open door. "Don't be crazy, Paul. You can't wade out into that," called Diane after him as he pushed the door open. "I'll be all right," he said, jumping down into the soft mud beside the vehicle, slamming the door behind him. "Max, and let him," she pleaded with the second youth, as reluctantly he pushed forward his own door handle. "He knows what he's doing." His voice failed to carry the certainty he tried to show. "It's too deep." "He'll be dragged away," she pleaded anxiously. "No, he won't," Max shouted back over the noise of rain battering the aluminum roof, before his door slammed shut too. Paul pulled the collar of his jacket up, high around his neck, trying to deflect the water that was already running down the inside of his shirt. He bent to unscrew the dirt-splattered shackle from under the front crossbar and unlock the winch. "Watch the end," he shouted to Max. "Don't let it run out. It's not secured." Paul began unwinding the rope from the rust-stained drum, thinking with every second that it wasn't a smart thing to do. He wound the rope around his wrist. Max watched Paul run a few steps to the back. He felt miserable standing in the rain, but felt no desire to change places. Paul stared into the water, soaked to the skin, even though wearing a supposedly waterproof jacket. It looked cold. He was scared. This really was a bad idea. They had to get across, but doubt was smothering him. He glanced back at the vehicle as his courage evaporated away, hoping anyone would give him an excuse not to step forward. The light was on inside. Behind the sweep of the wipers, through the steam of spray rising off the hood, Paul could see their faces watching him. He was too late to change his mind, now pinned in the yellow headlights. He was like a character on stage, in front of an anticipating audience. He turned away and looked down. Turbulent waters seemed to make it even more ominous than before. The surface was about half a meter down the slope. It was impossible to guess how much deeper it became out towards the middle. He tried desperately to recall their outward trip. But then this, like the dozen others they had crossed, had been a dry. And in their excitement, it had passed as an almost unnoticed depression. Paul looped some more rope around his wrist. He drew out the action. His brain was telling him no, and his pride, yes. In an instant, he made his decision and threw his foot forward, stepping over the bank onto the soft slope. Immediately that his patterned, sole touched ground, the clay sheared, and he began sliding sideways. Max could hardly make out more than a vague shape through the layer of water that distorted the lenses of his glasses. He thought Jason was looking at him. He wondered if he wanted him to do something. Max couldn't see or understand what it was. He loosened his hold on the rope for a moment, pulling the wet spectacles from the bridge of his nose. It was pointless trying to keep them clean. He went to put them in his pocket. A searing hot pain erupted across his palm as the wet rope suddenly, wildly ran over his wrist. Taken by surprise, he let his spectacles fly from his fingers, dropping them down into the deep mud at his feet. The loose drum hummed as it spun, and the rope rapidly unwound. Max looked in horror as the first layer wound off, and the second began its peel away across the drum. He grabbed for the rope, again trapping it inside his palm. The heat and pain were incredible. It stung and burnt his flesh. Over half of the cable had fed out by the time his smarting fingers grabbed at the mud-smeared top crash rail. Holding on to the wet metal, he lifted his foot from the clinging clay to jam the rope between the sole of his shoe and the steel guide. Chunks of mud spun away from under his foot as the last layer of rope wound off the drum towards him, showering gritty red flakes of corrosion onto his wet legs. Max stamped down harder. With barely any turns left, at last it stopped and was trapped. His hand painfully regained its hold.
"Jason," he shouted towards the cab. "Jason, I need you."
He called while trying to see through myopic eyes where Paul had gone. Jason had watched in horror as the youth had been swept away and was already getting out of the vehicle as Max uttered the desperate cry. He eased the drag that threatened to tear the rope again from the fear-stricken boy. "Where's Paul?" he said uselessly. I don't know. One moment he was there, then..." They looked over into the torrent. There was no sign of the youth, only the thin length of rope running taut away from them, disappearing below the water's muddy surface downstream.
The story continues in part 2, Evil Refuge.